Welcome to Raise the Roof, a bipartisan political podcast where we have a panel of speakers, two people representing the liberal-leaning ideology and two representing conservative-leaning ideology. Our goal is to prove that even with opposing ideas and beliefs, we can all still come together and work together. I'm your host and moderator, David Chan, and today our guests are Callie, Ash, Count Dooku, and Michael. Thank you guys so much for joining us today on our second political podcast. Now, today's topic is the environment, and let's jump in, starting off with some opening statements.
So first, I wanted to thank everyone for all the effort that was put into making this happen. And I especially wanted to thank my opponents today for being willing to have a civil conversation on a controversial issue such as this. I also wanted to thank David for his effort in making sure that all this goes smoothly. So first and foremost, I really want to establish what we share in common, because I think that establishing a common ground first is a great way to have an excellent debate on the things we actually do disagree on. So first and foremost, I'd like to establish that I'm no expert on climate change. Frankly, none of us are, but I do my best with the data that I have available to me, and I will try my best to reach a reasonable viewpoint. I think that we can also all agree that the end goal is to achieve the greatest outcome for the American people. And the reason that we are addressing this topic is because climate change does pose a threat to Americans. But in the end, we do want the best solution for we the people.
So I wanted to continue this. So my personal belief, or our personal belief on climate change, is that based on the data that we've seen, climate change is real. It is happening. And we would also say that a majority of climate change is attributed to human activity. I think we can also set a common ground in that we largely do trust the IPCC published data, but at the same time, we also have to acknowledge discrepancies. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that every single model the IPCC has put out in the past 30 years on the trajectory of climate change has been wrong from anywhere between 20 and 70% in terms of the overprediction. So we've seen greatly overestimated to the degree to which the climate will change. But to a large degree, I think we can all still settle that we trust the data put out by the IPCC to some degree, which I assume is a great common ground for all of us. And really, I think it's very important that we set just the basic data, and I'd like to quickly go through that. So to start off, the IPCC reports that human-induced warming reached above approximately 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels in 2017. And they expect that if we have absolutely zero intervention, temperatures will rise about 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius over the next century in the current projection. So they also note that sea level rise will be anywhere between 2.4 and 6.2 feet in the next century, which means about 187 million people across the globe would experience consequences, which is about 2% of the world population, and they would have their lives impacted in significant ways by rising sea levels. But again, this number assumes zero intervention or technology advancement for the next 100 years. But if you actually factor in technology advancement and intervention, that number is about 300,000 people who are still affected by rising sea levels. Professor Lombard from the Copenhagen Consensus Center in Europe breaks down the economic data as well. And he says that the UN Climate Panel, in conjunction with IPCC, says that in the next 50 years, the economic impact of climate change in the current projections results in each of us making 0.222%. We're basically 0.222% less well off in the next 50 years in terms of economic outcome. And by then, economic growth will have made us much richer than we all are today. So really, we're talking about a very slight problem in terms of economically. And to sum it all up, we wanted to say that this is a problem that we must address, and this is common ground between all of us. But our point is that this is not the end of the world.
We'd like to acknowledge and thank the listeners for their attentive support. Other than that, Michael's acknowledgements pretty much covered everything, so let's get right into it. The opposition mentioned lots of details, so we won't waste your time in reiterating them. However, We believe as scientific evidence irrefutably indicates that there is an impending climate disaster which will have catastrophic effects on the world as we know it. Already, polar ice caps have shrunk and sea levels have risen dramatically. Humankind continues to poke and exacerbate holes in the ozone layer. Carbon emissions have raised the temperature of our planet by 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit since pre-industrial times, as aforementioned by Count Dooku. Millions will be displaced from their homes as millions have been already due to rising coast levels, extreme weather conditions, erosion, and increasingly toxic atmospheric conditions.
Here's the bright side. This crisis is avoidable, at least for now. According to the IPCC study published in 2018, we have until 2030, 10 years from now, well, nearly 9 really, to take immediate action to mitigate this crisis before it gets exponentially worse. That's why we're here today, to raise awareness of the issues facing us and to discuss what we can collectively do about it as a society and as a world.
Hey, thank you guys so much for your opening statements. Now, I'm going to jump right in with the first question. So, carbon dioxide is one of the most talked about and highlighted greenhouse gas emissions. Many politicians have proposed a carbon tax in an attempt to curb the amount of carbon emitted into our atmosphere. The question is, do you think that carbon tax will lower carbon emissions? And if you think that that tax works, what effect will this tax have on the economy and our industries? If you don't think it works, what is a fair alternative? Why don't we start with the conservative ideology side? So why don't we start with either Count Dooku or Michael?
I think I'll go.
Yeah.
So our position on the carbon tax is that it's unlikely to work because I think we first have to address that the most important issue in terms of finding a solution to climate change is collective action. That is the number one thing that is needed, and that collective action globally. But the issue with carbon taxation is that the collective action actually plays a barrier to it. So being realistic, the only way for a carbon tax to actually work, and if you look at the data for this, theoretically, a carbon tax could work if it is a global carbon tax that applies to every single country universally. But the problem is there's two big problems with this, and it's unlikely to work for these two problems. Number one, a carbon tax would severely hurt smaller and less developed countries much more than us. So again, it's collective issue, and every country has to sign on to it, but there are hundreds of smaller and less developed countries that would never sign on to something like this. In addition, there's a bunch of countries like communist China, Russia, India, and frankly, many other countries who have no interest in abiding by this. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin really have no interest in what Greta Thunberg has to say. So now I'd like to get into what a carbon tax on the national level would look like. So we believe that there's actually no point in creating a tax on the national level because it accomplishes nearly nothing in terms of global carbon reduction. And we talked about that. That's because of the collective action issue. And also following the laws of economics, producers would pass the carbon tax on to consumers. And this is just like a sales tax. And this is common in economics. And this would severely hurt poor Americans because this would be a regressive tax. And it would create a great deal of inefficiency in the market. So for basically no mitigation on the global stage, we would be decimating our own economy regressively with the carbon tax if we were to implement it on a national level. So because of that, we really do believe that a global tax is nearly impossible and a national carbon tax is unrealistic.
Okay, thank you. And now from the liberal side.
If I may, I agree that a global tax is unrealistic because who would we pay for it? Who would we pay it to? There is no global government. But on the national level, we must consider the economic concept of incentive. The reasoning behind having a carbon tax is to incentivize larger corporations, as climate change is largely a corporate responsibility and falls only around 8% to the individual. That provides them an incentive to invest in greener infrastructure and transportation, for instance. While I do agree that it won't directly influence anything, it will have an indirect impact and long-term impact on the motivations from corporations and companies in order to reduce their carbon emissions. Of course, you made the excellent point that developing countries will have difficulty with that. If I remember correctly, in 1992, George H.W. Bush, to be specific, went to a United Nations prospect discussing climate change. And for that one, they specifically said that the developing countries, the biggest emitters such as China, the US, India, etc., would be the ones responsible for upholding the carbon emission tax, and the developing countries would receive funds and aid from those developed countries in order to finish off what they needed to do in terms of infrastructure and developing. But I'm not an expert in economics. However, Ash, I think, is much more competent in that than I am. So I'll just pass the mic to him.
Yeah, to elaborate a little bit on incentives and all that, there actually are some solutions to the collective action problem. For example, taxing imported carbon as well as manufactured carbon at home is a solution as well. And as far as the effectiveness of these carbon taxes, well, we don't need to speculate. It's already happening, and there is research on past climate carbon taxes. For example, Canada has one right now. British Columbia has had one for years before Canada passed one nationally. And in British Columbia, after passing their carbon tax, they had reduced emissions by nearly 5%, while their GDP continued to increase by 11%. So there's really no economic harm in passing a carbon tax. There's a similar story in Switzerland as well. No, Sweden? Yeah, Sweden actually, where they passed a carbon tax as well, and it managed to reduce their emissions by a considerable amount, also about 11%. And yeah, there was also no major economic downfall in Sweden. Actually, quite the opposite. Sweden is continuing to be a very strong global economy. So there is data on the issue as well. Most economists even agree that a carbon tax is an effective way to reduce carbon emissions while doing little to no harm, if anything, good to global economies as well.
So I'd like to respond to that and then pass it on to Michael. So I'd like to just respond to some of what you said. So you said that there is really no problem with economic growth when you pass a carbon tax. The problem with this is that overall economic growth continues, but the issue is that a carbon tax is a regressive tax. It behaves in the same nature as a sales tax. It's passed on to the consumer, which hurts smaller businesses and it hurts consumers. Bigger businesses do not really feel much of an impact and economies continue to grow. A lot of the countries you mentioned, like Sweden and Switzerland, they've already transitioned far away from carbon. They've actually moved largely to solutions like nuclear energy. I think Sweden, almost half of all of their energy comes from nuclear energy. The issue is in the United States, there's strong pushback from that, from Democrats in particular. And I'd like to pass it to Michael. I think you wanted to talk about China in this.
Yeah. So you were talking about the collective action and how a carbon tax has worked in some countries, supposedly, but I'd like to note that there's bigger problems here than a carbon tax in the United States. Forbes notes that China alone produces more carbon dioxide than US, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Republic of Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, almost every developed country in the world combined. If you add India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Japan into the mix on China's side, the Asia Pacific region accounts by itself for well over half of the world's carbon emissions. So I think that the solution is not to produce carbon taxes and regulation that will lead to government overreach in a country that has already done well over its part to combat this problem.
And while we're on this topic of countries working in regards to the environment as a whole, I want to transition into exactly what you guys just mentioned, this collective activism. China is currently the world's biggest polluter. And when considering an issue as large as global warming, what do you think are the right steps or solutions towards a global reform regarding environmentalism?
Well, there are a couple ideas for that. As I mentioned, there are ideas about taxing imported carbon as well. And we do have the Paris Climate Accords, but those are largely toothless. So we do need more international treaties on carbon regulation and emissions that are more strictly enforced, perhaps through sanctions or trade. And I wonder if Kelly has any more thoughts on this as well.
I do. So just to give Michael some context, you are absolutely right that China is the biggest polluter by 27%, 27.8% of the world's carbon dioxide. However, the US is the second biggest at 15.2, a little bit over half of China. You do make a good point that lots of developed countries are could make up the total of China and still not amount to the complete total. India, Russian Federation, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Canada also amount for some of the largest carbon emitters in the world. However, the US still remains the second largest. And although you are right in the fact that we cannot just expect that only US actions will provide change, as the second biggest carbon emitter, we do have a responsibility to uphold a green energy concept, and that's been suggested by the Green New Deal. However, Ash also touched on the Paris Climate Accords. 197 of the existing countries in the world had been signed to that, and 179 of them had been officially signed to it and had solidified their individual national plans to reduce carbon emissions. However, when Donald Trump formally signed to leave the Paris Climate Agreement, the second largest polluter in the world left the climate agreement. The Paris Agreement outlines different ways to individually, as developed countries, reduce carbon emissions in an attempt to reduce temperature increases in over a century. We've seen that it hasn't been working out very well, but as an international effort fueled by different national efforts and not simply an international tax, for example, which I personally think is ridiculous, like you said earlier. I'm not calling what you said ridiculous. I just think a global tax is ridiculous because it's just unrealistic. However, at the national level, if all the nations worked together, which is probably a little bit optimistic, we could achieve a lot of things. And to reiterate, as the US is one of the most, it's the richest country in the world. We are the second biggest emitter in the world. We have interesting relations with China, but we probably have a lot of control of our relations with China, who is the actual biggest emitter. And I think that there's a lot that we as a country could do for the rest of the world.
So I think you made some great points. I really like to respond to all of those. So you guys really talked about Paris Climate Accords and collective action. So I think for the audience to really understand this, I think it's really important to actually dive into what the Paris Climate Accords were. So the Paris Climate Accords, quite simply described, were really just a giant waste of time. And in my opinion, this is honestly why Democrat politicians wanted to join them, and this is because they are non-binding. So this basically allows Democrat politicians to turn around and tell people that somehow they're solving climate change and in the process obtaining their votes. This agreement personally drives me up a wall because it's completely useless, yet often many people still believe that they did something. Basically, signing on to the Paris agreements means that Democrat politicians get to sound like they care a lot about climate change without actually doing anything, especially when they're looking for youth votes. So just diving into the idea of the Paris Accords is basically that a bunch of countries declared their commitment to voluntary reductions of carbon emissions. There's no enforcement mechanism. There's nothing that enforces China to keep by its commitments. In fact, China has done exactly the opposite of keeping by its commitments to the Paris Accords. Same goes for Russia, India, and actually almost every other country. And frankly, a vast majority of the countries have gone in the exact opposite direction of the agreement, and there's nothing that forces them to abide by it. The agreement is basically an attempt by democratic administrations to say that we're taking climate change seriously when they aren't.
I have a question for the opposition.
Reality.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, I think
you cut in, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to go back to where I was. So the agreement is basically an attempt by democratic administrations to say that we're taking climate change seriously when we really aren't. The way that you would actually enforce it is by passing legislation, making it reality after battling it out in the legislature. But right now, it's just a public proclamation that we care about climate change without really any real strategies or content to make it work. So I think, Michael, you wanted to continue that.
Really quickly, do you mind if I ask the opposition a question? I'm sorry to cut you off, Michael, but I do
Yes, I
have
don't mind.
a clarification question. So you were talking about government overreach earlier and how that's like it could lead to totalitarianism is what I inferred from it. And I don't think government overreach is a good idea, to put it simply. However, we also discussed that there's nothing in place to enforce the Paris Climate Agreement. So would you consider those enforcements to potentially lead to government overreach? I just want to make sure that there's some continuity here.
So I'll respond to that first before giving it back to Michael. So when I was talking about enforcement, I was really talking about enforcement in the agreement itself. So when they signed on to the agreement, it was just a declaration that we care about climate change. And it said guidelines for countries to follow. And the fact is, not a single country really followed those guidelines. And that was because there was no enforcement mechanism when people signed on to the agreement. So there was actually no reason for countries to follow it. So Michael, you can take it from here.
I agree with Kyung-Soo here. I think that it's not government overreach to set up a committee and then expect them to, and then set an expectation that they follow what you're putting forth in the committee, and then they just don't do it, and you have no way to hold them to that. So I don't think that's government overreach. I think that's just an expectation. So
Wait.
whether the, yeah. Did you have something?
No.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarification.
So returning to what I was saying about the Paris Climate Accords, I think that we as Americans should not be bound by a ridiculous commitment that nobody abides by it. Like you said, there's no enforcement for this. And one of the big problems with climate change is collective action. Like we're
Question about that,
returning.
actually.
Circle.
Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. What do you mean when you say we're bound by an agreement? When you say that it's non-binding, could you explain what you mean by that? When you say that we shouldn't be bound to a non-binding agreement?
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about that. So when it comes to being bound by an agreement, no other country actually was bound by it because there's no enforcement mechanism. If you actually look at the real data, we are the only country that actually had carbon reduction since 2007, and it actually really ramped up once Trump came into office. We are the only country that has seen reductions in our carbon emissions. Every other part of the world has seen vast increases in their carbon emissions. So basically what we're saying is that what we're saying is that the Paris Climate Agreement includes provisions that would hurt us economically in the name of collective action towards climate change. If no other country abides by it, why should we abide by it? And largely we haven't abided by either. We've gone on our own path. And what Trump came in and he declared that the Paris Climate Agreement was a waste of time and energy, and it sets a ridiculous commitment to reach that we aren't going to reach, as no other country has, and we shouldn't have any interest in reaching it if no other country is doing it. I mean, Americans should not be bound by a commitment that nobody else in the world abides by. And one of the big problems is the collective action issue. So I wanted to go also talk more about our reduction. So in 1990, we passed, I think it was somewhat of a long-term strategy to combat climate change. And as a result, we've seen carbon emissions go down year on end since 2007. So studying the data actually put out by the EIA, I got it right here, largely between 2007 until the time of the Paris Agreement, we saw slight reductions in carbon emissions year on year, about 1% to 1.5% annually. However, they report that since the 2016-2019 period, we've seen significantly larger reductions in carbon emissions, and largely this is due to fracking, increase in natural gas usage rather than coal and gasoline, and also an increase in nuclear energy usage. So I think Michael also wanted to finish his point.
Yeah, so to your point, Ash, about me talking about a agreement being binding and non-binding at the same time. So there's different levels to this agreement. See, so there's the global level and then there's the national level. So at the global level, this is non-binding. We had no reason to follow this agreement. But at the national level, the Democrat Party has enforced this and tried to reach into our businesses, reach into private things that should be privately owned, and make this deal a reality. So the Democrats are the ones enforcing it, where the Paris Climate Agreement, the people that in charge of that did not enforce it. So that's my point, where both perspectives are true.
What do you
Well-
have to say about the Republican lack of action in regards to the entire situation regarding climate? Because as you mentioned, Democrats are definitely doing performative activism when it comes to this, pretending to care about it when they actually really don't seem to. But the Republicans have made zero action whatsoever. So is there
So-
any explanation that you have for that?
Yeah, so I wanted to just build off what I was saying earlier, that we are actually the only country that's actually seeing reductions, and this is due to fracking and natural gas usage plus nuclear energy. And honestly, a lot of credit for this goes to both Obama and Trump, because Obama supported an increase in fracking, and it grew exponentially after that with Trump. And meanwhile, the so-called progressive European nations saw an average increase of 1.8 degrees in their carbon emissions during the same time period. And by the way, the early reports from 2020 indicate that we saw a 3% reduction in carbon emissions. Basically, we're the only country who's moving in the right direction. The World Resources Institute also, I think, reported that the US seems to have peaked in our use of carbon, and then we're just going to keep seeing declines year on year. But yeah, back to the Paris Climate Agreement. The fact is that we shouldn't have to pursue these doctrines of the Paris Agreement when the so-called renewable energy strategy that was laid out is not working, because no country has seen reductions. We are the only country that's seen reductions when we went our own way with the fracking, natural gas, and nuclear energy. And the solutions put out by Republicans are actually quite moderate. I would say that personally, I believe they should be more hardlined, but we can get into the details of those if you guys would like.
Yeah,
I'd love to know
do.
about alternatives. Oh, I'm sorry, Ash, I cut you off.
Oh, I just said, yeah, do elaborate. I would like to hear his elaboration on this.
Sure. Okay, so just elaborating on the solutions. So when it comes to solutions, the reason why you see backlash from conservatives is, first, I wanted to address that, is that a lot of the solutions that have been put out, like Green New Deal and Paris Climate Agreement, either it's useless like Paris Climate Agreement, or it's completely radical like Green New Deal, where it would plunge our economy back into the 1850s. So, I mean, we can talk more about that later, but the problem is that no realistic solution has come from the left. And largely because of that, you've seen backlash on the right. But there has actually been solutions proposed. So just getting into that, first and foremost, the solutions that a lot of conservatives talk about surrounds the idea of free markets. So the reason why we've actually seen reductions so far is because we've let free markets go on their way. They've ramped up fracking, natural gas usage, and also they've improved technology for nuclear power. And because of that, we've seen reductions. The very notion that the free markets can't solve this issue is pretty ludicrous, because the free markets and humans have invented and innovated their way out of every single problem that we've come about. I mean, it's going to take some time. But the thing is, there is an incentive structure here. The fact is that whoever comes up with a non-renewable source that's cheaper than hydrocarbons is going to be the richest human in the history of the world. Okay, there's an incredible incentive structure in order to do that. And we are moving in the right direction. And I've already mentioned this many times now. We've already started moving away from coal and gasoline more to natural gas and fracking. And then I think a long-term solution would be nuclear power. Nuclear power is the only realistic solution that's renewable, completely clean. It's pretty cheap too, comparatively, and it doesn't require significant amounts of mining and natural environment destruction as solar and wind do. And I think France already supplies 70% of their energy with nuclear energy, so they've done a good job there on that. Sweden, I said, already supplies 50%. I think that is the only long-term realistic solution that can actually be used here.
Well, you said that it's not that fracking doesn't cause as many environmental concerns as other renewable sources, correct?
Yeah,
I'm not
fracking
really
is,
sure.
is much less than the rest of them.
I'm not entirely sure that's true, actually, because fracking has actually a good deal of concerns by itself. Contamination of groundwater, methane pollution, potential links to earthquakes, waste disposal as well. Yeah, fracking is hardly a perfect solution at all. It's actually quite flawed and dangerous as well. Many of the same scientists who support the action we've taken so far think we should be going farther, and that fracking is by no means a final solution for this.
Yeah, I agree. I never said
As
it was
well-
a final solution, but I'm sorry, I cut you off. Were you going to say something?
No, I'll continue after.
Okay, I don't think that fracking is the long-term solution, but it's definitely moved us in the right direction. I think it's very important to acknowledge that we're the only country in the world that saw reductions, and we're seeing more and more reductions year on end. And the reason why we've seen these reductions is because we've moved away from current hydrocarbons like coal and gasoline, and we moved towards fracking and natural gas, and that's just in the temporary to move us in the right direction. The fact is that you can't just shut down an entire economy and completely change the source of energy overnight. It has to be a transition. Fracking seems to be the best way to do that. I think fracking is significantly more safe than the rest of them. I agree, it has its own problems, which is why, again, I think in the long run, nuclear energy is the solution.
Well, I'd like to go on a little more about that actually. Well, for starters, in a little bit, I'd like to hear your evidence as to why other sources of renewable energy are more dangerous. But let's talk about first the claim that the economy would be tanked by switching to renewable energy. That's simply not true, actually. Some countries have tried more renewable energy, and it's been very effective. I believe it was Spain. Correct me if I'm wrong. It could be wrong, but Spain, some other country, tried switching to renewable energy with solar power, and they actually had a abundance of energy from that, and it was actually quite beneficial for their economy as well. To talk about economics a little more, there are actually costs to not switching to renewable energy as well, and to not meeting the 2030 goal for net zero emissions. For example, hurricanes have been getting more deadly and more dangerous and more destructive as well lately. There's also the wildfires wrecking the entire west coast of the United States, and these are all directly related to climate change. There are billions of dollars of damage that are done by these every year. Actually, I have this number right here. The average damage of $1 billion plus hurricanes has increased from about a little over $4 billion in damage per hurricane in 1980 to $70 billion in damage for each hurricane over $1 billion in 2017. Hurricanes are getting much more destructive and cause us a lot of taxpayer money to repair after these. And that's the result of climate change. To talk a little more about the Green New Deal as well and the benefits of it, I'm going to hand it off to Callie now.
Thank you, Ash. Well, I'd love to touch on all of the individual details. I'll just stick to a couple of things and then transition to the other solutions that we have in mind. So the Green New Deal would aim to create 100 million jobs for Americans. I think it's rather self-explanatory that Americans with jobs that can pay for things will help boost the economy. And considering a lot of the military budget right now goes toward safeguarding oil in military bases, especially internationally, we'd be able to cut the budget by 50%. That saves us billions of dollars. I don't have the exact number right now, but it will save us billions of dollars that can go into other things. Also, you said it wouldn't happen overnight. That, of course, it's unrealistic to expect anything to happen instantaneously, but the goal is for it to be reduced by, I think, 80% by 2030 and then 100% by 2035. So we have 10 to 15 years to do that. Now, I'd like to touch on the other alternatives for cleaner energy that we went over. You went over fracking, which I think is a great solution as a preemptive solution, for example. And I'd like to talk about the other ones. So the most common one that I've seen so far is solar energy. The main issue with that is that it's expensive and it costs a lot of real estate because it has to be flat, parallel, and reflect the sunlight. However, I've seen places like Kaiser Permanente use solar panels as parking structure shade, which can kill two birds with one stone. There's also tide energy, but that is, again, expensive, and it's kind of difficult to build things underwater for imaginable reasons. And they are subject to increased weathering and erosion due to the constant tides. Another solution would be wind, and wind has little to no backfire aside from the potential to kill a couple of birds. It takes up a lot less real estate than solar does, or nuclear for a nuclear power plant, and it's reasonably cheap compared to the other ideas that we have. There's also the concept of geothermal, although that is not great for the foundation of the earth. So it has more to do in order to get to where it needs to be. There's kinetic energy, although that's rather unreliable and technology is very primitive as of right now. It takes a lot of kinetic input for little to no actual energetic output. So until systems are revised and improved, it's not really a viable option. Hydrogen is a completely clean burning fuel, and it will release water vapor and warm air once burned. However, it comes from fossil fuels, so that won't really do much indirectly. So it's not a great idea. Natural gas is already being implemented, as you mentioned, and I think that's an absolutely amazing idea, and I think we should definitely focus on making that more widespread. Although carbon emissions are reduced, though, and it's less than that of dirty coal or traditional methods, there are still carbon emissions that are there. Of course, there's no perfect solution, like Ash mentioned earlier, but we do need to be mindful of solutions that are better than others. Nuclear, I agree that we should go for nuclear power. I don't really side with the Democratic Party on that. The main reason for the opposition would be safety, and the main way to ensure safety would be to invest in and perfect cooling services and cooling systems, I'm sorry. It's rather dangerous when harnessed incorrectly, but it's very clean, very powerful, and very efficient when it's harnessed correctly. We just need to make sure that there's no room for human error, which is a little bit difficult because we're all humans here. Geothermal, like I mentioned earlier, is also very expensive up front, but it's also increasing in popularity. It saw 5% growth as a sector in 2015. And the World Bank estimates that around 40 countries could meet their energy demands using geothermal power. There's a lot of ways to do this rather safely. The most dangerous one would really be nuclear. And if we have the right people on the job and sound engineering, there's not really much in the way of danger for that.
So I
Go ahead,
have
Matt.
serious problems with wind and solar. So first of all, there has to be an understanding in the physics and science behind wind and solar. And a good foundation for this is all sources of energy have limits that can't be exceeded. The maximum rate at which the sun's photons can be converted to electrons is about 33%, and our best solar technology is around 26%, so fairly close to that. And for wind, the maximum capture is 60%, and our best machines are 45%. We can still have a ways to go, but it's not exactly the most efficient solution. So we're pretty close to wind and solar technology limits. Batteries to store electricity produced by wind and solar are also a huge problem. The sheer amount of batteries and the capacity of those batteries would be incredible. And there was a report I read that if you took Tesla's largest gigafactory and ran it 24 hours a day for 500 years, we'd still barely be approaching the capacity we need to store just one day of America's energy usage. You can actually see the effects of this in California, where we've been switching to more renewable energy, rolling blackouts across the state. I think that's I'd love to say a great example, but it's really not a great example considering all the people, especially those that are more poor, that are affected by this.
I think it's unrealistic to imagine that there aren't going to be unfavorable outcomes or side effects for for switching to renewable energy. Like Count Dooku said, it's just not realistic to think of switching things overnight, and there's going to be hiccups in the process to do so. So you bring up an excellent point that there's not a lot of efficiency with the wind and solar energy. The fact that there's any efficiency at all is promising, but there's more on that I'd like to pass it off to Ash.
Yeah, speaking of coal efficiency, actually, coal efficiency is about 40%, and natural gas is about 60% efficiency. So really less than or roughly equal to, in the case of natural gas, the efficiency of wind panels. And to talk more about some of the downfalls of producing energy by various sources, you mentioned some rolling blackouts caused by renewable energy sources, but let's also talk about some of the downfalls that also disproportionately affect poor people caused by non-renewable fossil fuels. For example, the rising sea levels caused by greenhouse emissions from fossil fuels disproportionately affect poor people and those in the global south and non-coastal regions. There's also the effect of heat waves, which again disproportionately affect those in the equator region and in the global south, that are actually one of the most deadly killers as a result of climate change. So there are certainly drawbacks to renewable energy, but really, in terms of human life, they're actually, you could argue, less than that of the cost of fossil fuels and their effects on the environment and on human lives.
So
We're looking
there's a lot
Go
to
ahead.
respond to based on what everyone's said. So first, I'm going to get to what you said about natural disasters. Then I'm going to touch more on solar, wind, and other renewable energy. So first, just getting to natural disasters. So the problem with the data surrounding natural disasters getting worse is that it's presented with one major intellectual fallacy. They measure this data by looking at the level of destruction and cost or damage. This is often the way that these climate scientists, they say that okay, natural disasters are getting worse. The raw way that they measure this is by simply looking at the cost and damage of the destruction. And the thing is that it's simply that more stuff is getting destroyed. If you look at the way that they collect this data and present it, the reality is that it's just more stuff is getting destroyed. Human beings are exponentially wealthier now than we used to be, and we're building way more stuff in the way of natural disasters. That's why costs are up. The fact is that the number of natural disasters has not changed much. Now I wanted to talk about California wildfires. So these have been a hot topic recently.
Sorry, but to refute that claim, the numbers I said earlier, 4 billion per natural disaster in 1990 versus 70 billion now, was inflation adjusted. So anyway, continue.
It's not about inflation adjusted. It's just we've created more wealth in the economy. There's a big difference. Inflation is simply the devaluing of your currency. You still have the same amount of wealth.
Correct.
The thing is that our economy has significantly more wealth now than in 1990. We've seen exponential economic growth. We're building more stuff in the way of natural disasters. So now talking about California wildfires in particular, they've been a hot topic. I think Gavin Newsom said that you can attribute them to climate change. The reality is that we've always had wildfires. The environment has small scale wildfires to kind of burn out dead brush, and this usually protects from huge fires. The thing is, where humans live, we normally don't let these small fires happen because they also pose a threat to our homes. So instead, what they do around the world, and actually in every other state other than California, is they have controlled logging operations and controlled burns. But California has a significant environmental lobby who basically shut this down. So we had no controlled burns and no natural burning as well. So there was just dead brush accumulating. And in 2018, if everyone remembers, the town of Paradise burned to the ground. Over 10,000 homes were destroyed. 85 people died. So the equipment from PG&E that actually started this fire dates back to 1921. Every single major fire we've seen for decades now has been in the same situation. They've all dated back from before the 1950s. And why is that? Every other state has upgraded their electric grid. California has the most ancient electric grid, and that's because previous Democrat governors in California have set restrictions on these public utility companies where a significant amount of their funds that would go to replacing old infrastructure goes to combating climate change. So because of that, we've had old infrastructure sitting around getting old, and this is causing fires. And this is why you don't see it largely in other states. Some other states you do because they're in similar situations. Oregon also does the same thing, I think. And a few other states do it. And they also had big wildfires, and it's a common trend. It has nothing to do with climate change. The number of raw fires are the same. The only reason we're seeing them being more damaging is because there's so much dry brush sitting around for this reason. Now, I wanted to also talk about the solar and wind thing that you guys were mentioning. So the problem with solar and wind is that they're not very effective. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars in solar and wind in terms of federal subsidies, and even more on top of that in private investment. So the problem right now is they barely supply anything. And we've already spent tons of money in them. The issue is that it's just not as sustainable as nuclear or any other form. And I think the statistic is that the total waste from worn out solar panels and windmills by just the year 2050 is going to double all of the world's current plastic pollution today. So it's not like there's no downfalls to it. You have to mine tons of rare earth metals, and there's tons of waste from these things. So I think what's most important is that we look to reasonable solutions like nuclear, like we mentioned earlier, and then in the process, maybe fracking natural gas, the things that we know are working for sure, and that can actually scale up. Nuclear already provides 70% of France's energy and 40% of Sweden's energy. So I think we're going to start wrapping up now. I think let's just go through and everybody make one more point now.
If you don't mind, I'd like to move towards solutions now, because I think we've established the back and forth by now,
Yeah.
and it's probably about time to find some common ground. So I think we can all agree here that nuclear energy is a great investment. Is there any opposition to that? Okay, so nuclear energy is definitely something that we should be investing in. I think also fracking is a great preemptive solution that you mentioned earlier. However, regardless of how ineffective solar and wind are currently, I think our technology has the capacity to improve. And while we are still switching from others, we can use it as a little bit of a buffer, if you know what I mean. So we can use it to increase and rebuff or reinforce, for example, the current energy that we have right now that we're getting from natural gas, a little bit of nuclear, which of course, as you mentioned, is not as popular in the US, which I disagree with, and some fracking. So I think if we can implement as many solutions as possible, we have a chance to save the Earth. However, I do agree with you that the best solutions here would probably be nuclear and natural gas.
So the thing about this is none of the Democrat politicians have actually put out a realistic solution to this that didn't either kill millions of people or plunge us into an 1850s economy. So the Paris Climate Agreement, that's nonsense. It achieved nothing and only made it worse for us here in the US. And the Obama approach of subsidizing the green energy companies proved to be a failure as well, very unsustainable. And I believe the largest green energy company in the country just went under recently as the hundreds of $millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies Obama gave to them started to run out. The Green New Deal.
I'm sorry, go for it. I'll cut you off. That's my bad.
And the Green New Deal is essentially just a $93 trillion spending bill with the Communist Manifesto attached to it.
If you don't mind, I'd like to focus mostly on solutions instead of like rebuking.
Yeah, so I was just going to build off of him. So those are kind of our viewpoints on the current things. And in terms of solutions, we've had a pretty hearty debate on this. And I think that we actually come to a good agreement. I think nuclear and natural gas. I think we have disagreement on solar and wind. And I think the point that Michael was trying to make is that the current approach is not working. And exactly. we do have to move towards better solutions. The Green New Deal will not work. Paris Climate Agreement did not work. Obama approach did not work. And I think it's very good that we had this discussion and we can actually come up with realistic solutions, nuclear and natural gas and fracking. So I'm really glad we did come to certain common ground. And we really wanted to thank, I wanted to thank everyone for such a cordial discussion. So I think we still have one more closing statement.
From Ash.
Yep.
Oh, we're closing already. Interesting. Yeah. I do think that the Green New Deal actually is a decent solution. I think there's a pretty stark contrast between, quote, Communist Manifesto attached to it and tanking the economy and creating 100 million jobs in energy and transport. That is just one of the proposed solutions, though, and there certainly is room for a debate on more solutions and room for improvement on everything. There are certainly, as Callie mentioned earlier, and everybody else mentioned, I believe, actually, nuclear energy is a solution, which could be implemented. Fracking is currently better than what we had before, but it is certainly not going to be a good long-term alternative. We can agree on that. And yeah, with this little bit of common ground, hopefully we can move forward just a little bit. Although I do encourage everybody as well to look into the Green New Deal because it has already been proposed and it is not nearly as bad as the right Fox News will have you make it out to be.
I'd be happy to send my notes if anyone's interested.
All right. Does anyone have any last remarks or anything? No? Okay. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. I just want to thank you guys so much for coming onto the show and for serving as our guest speakers, along with thanking our audience for making it through this podcast. We hope that through these discussions, we open this is to the audience, we open your horizon to alternate perspectives and beliefs that will contribute to a more well-rounded political point of view. So make sure to follow our Instagram at Raise Humane Foundation for more updates, along with subscribe to our YouTube for more podcasts in the future. Thank you guys so much.